Hey everyone, I'm Oloshide with another Brotato guide. This guide will focus on the four main builds that you can go for on Brotato, which are melee, ranged, elemental, and engineering, while also going a bit more in depth analyzing their best starting weapons. Let's start with the melee builds. First of all, with melee builds, I'm mostly referring to any weapon that requires you to be somewhat close to your enemies, even if the weapon doesn't deal melee damage. Melee builds are usually fairly balanced between offense and defense. They're very good at dealing with multiple enemies since beams from melee weapons can hit multiple targets as long as they're in reach. This also means that it's a bit easier to keep up with the damage, allowing you to invest a bit more into defensive stats. The main disadvantage of melee builds is the range of most weapons. This forces you to be closer to your enemies, making it harder to avoid taking some damage. Another main disadvantage are ranged enemies and charging enemies. Especially when there are many, it can become quite problematic to deal with them. These downsides can be mitigated by investing more in defensive stats and range, but that means less money for offense or other utility items. Another downside is that many melee weapons are too slow to utilize lifesteal efficiently, forcing you to rely on health regen or consumables for sustain, which are often a lot more expensive to build. Because of all this, melee builds requires you to be more careful with your movement to avoid taking damage. Also, many melee weapons are pretty bad, due to a combination of short range, low speed, or low damage. Stick is one of the best melee weapons, and overall probably the best early game weapon. The extra health from Primitive is very good early on, and since they scale their base damage simply by having extra sticks, you don't need to prioritize melee damage anymore. All this, together with the fact that sticks are also very cheap, means that you can focus even more money into economy items, making you even stronger for the later parts of the run. The major downsides of sticks are the range and the slow speed, which can lead to being overwhelmed by some enemies in the mid game, starting from wave 10, but especially on wave 14-15 of the crash zone. Prioritize attack speed and don't take too much melee damage, especially early on. Spear's main advantage is its high range, which grants a lot of safety despite being a melee weapon. Together with its high damage and the primitive bonus for early health, Spear is easily one of the best melee weapons. Similarly to sticks, its main disadvantage is the low speed. So prioritize attack speed and avoid range. Justin Lance is very similar to Spear, but there are a few differences. It gets the medieval set instead of primitive, which makes it slightly worse early on, but better overall. Then, it also scales its damage with both melee and movement speed. Scaling damage with a defensive stat is extremely valuable, and this means that you're often ignoring melee damage in order to focus primarily on movement speed. Because of this, you rarely want to mix Justin Lances with other melee weapons. Also, Justin Lances reduce your damage when you're not moving, which can be quite annoying in some situations, especially against elite and bosses. Another important factor is that the damage reduction is applied to your stats, and not just the weapon, so your overall damage will be reduced when you stand still. Prioritize attack speed and speed. Avoid range, and avoid melee damage unless mixing Justin Lance with other melee weapons. Javelin is technically a ranged weapon, but since it scales with melee damage, I'm including it in this list since it can be easily mixed with other melee weapons. In a way, Javelin is also similar to Spear despite being a ranged weapon, since it shares the primitive bonus and it has high reach and pierce. Javelin also gets a lot of value from upgrades, which they reduce the amount of shots required for the guaranteed crit. For that very reason, Javelin is amazing when cursed, since it will affect not only the damage, but the crit multiplier and its passive effect, reducing the amount of shots required for the crit even more. Since Javelin is not a melee weapon, but a ranged projectile, it can struggle against too many enemies, especially considering the low speed. So prioritize attack speed, avoid range and crit, avoid sharp bullet, pumping is great, and it can mix with Spear to help against hordes. Fist deals good damage, is very fast, has high knockback, and it's fairly cheap, while the main downside is its low range. Try to not mix it with claw since Fist has low crit scaling. Also, focus primarily on melee damage first, but since upgrades increase the flat damage, it becomes progressively less useful. Thief Dagger is a cheap weapon that generates materials, making it quite strong early on. The benefits from scaling crit can be quite good long term, but crit is an expensive stat to invest early on. The main downsides are overall the lower damage and short range. Because of this, it often wants to transition into stronger weapons later in the run, but that's not strictly necessary, especially if you get enough value from the extra materials to compensate for these downsides. Crit is great to generate materials more consistently, but don't prioritize it too much over the main offensive stats. Claw has high single target damage and it scales with attack speed and crit. It's weaker early on and it has a relatively short range. The main offensive stats are still a priority over crit early on, so it can take a bit for Claw to scale properly. Knife is overall similar to Claw, with high single target damage and even better crit scaling. However, it suffers from the same downside, which is a bit weaker early on and it has a short range. Crit is extremely valuable, especially with upgrades, but don't prioritize it too much over the other main stats. These are other good melee weapons that don't usually scale with melee damage. Shield scales purely with armor, which makes it a very strong weapon since armor is already the best priority for defensive stats. The eye knockback can also be quite useful, especially when a bit behind with damage. All this makes shield builds incredibly tanky. Medieval and Blunt are also great bonuses, but the negative speed from Blunt can be problematic early on. Scaling the damage with armor is great. However, armor is harder to find and more expensive in comparison to melee damage, and overall, shield's damage tends to be lower in comparison to most melee weapons. Also, like most melee weapons, it has a short range and slow attacks. Try to prioritize armor even more, since it's now both the best offensive and defensive stat. Hiking Pole's main advantage is that it scales its own damage by generating more range over time. Also, the support bonus is great for extra economy. The main downside is that it can be fairly weak early on when the range is still low. Also, very high range in the later stages of the game can reduce the attack speed quite a bit, since it makes the attack animation even longer. It's not a major downside, but something to take into account. Range and movement speed for faster scaling become a lot more valuable for Hiking Pole. Attack speed is also more and more valuable to compensate for the high range. Lute scales primarily with luck and has the support bonus for extra economy. He can deal good single target damage thanks to the stacking debuff, and he can be easily mixed with flutes for extra survivability against bigger enemies, since they both scale with luck and share the musical tag. Scaling luck also means more general value, especially from the extra consumables for more survivability. Lute's main downsides are the usual short range and slow speed like most melee weapons, and the fact that it doesn't mix well with other melee weapons unless going for melee damage, but at that point you're losing most of its value from the luck scaling. A 4-2 or 3-3 split with flutes are probably the ideal setup. Sickles scale primarily with harvesting, and together with its support bonus, it becomes a great weapon to scale your economy. Sickle runs are usually very strong later in the run thanks to the high income, but they can struggle in the early stages of the game. Besides that, one of its major downsides is the very low range, so addressing that becomes one of the priority for Sickle. About 50 to 100 extra range is usually a good spot, but more is always better as long as you can afford it. Sword is overall a good weapon. Trident is very similar to Spear. It's slower but does higher damage. Captain's Sword is essentially a stronger sword with extra curse scaling, and you should just ignore the passive effect. Thunder Sword is also a slightly better sword for pure melee. It's very strong for hybrid melee and elemental builds, or just pure elemental since the projectiles are only elemental scaling. Chainsaw is overall a good weapon with multiple sources of scaling, so it gets even better if you also have some engineering or lifesteal. The passive effect is also great for elite and bosses, since it deals extra damage based on their current health. With range builds, I'll be mostly referring to the playstyle of range weapons, even if they're not dealing range damage. Range builds usually prioritize offensive stats over defensive ones. This is because they can take advantage of their range to avoid damage more easily. With enough damage, most enemies will die before they can even approach you, making range builds extremely safe to play in comparison to melee. The only exceptions are some tanky enemies and obviously elite and bosses. However, it becomes a lot easier to deal with them when there are less enemies, since you can focus on their attack patterns instead. Another big advantage of range builds is the fact that most range weapons are very good, and you can easily mix them up, especially to cover for specific weaknesses. For all these reasons, range builds are usually the best ones for all the versatile characters that don't have specific support for other type of weapons. The main disadvantage of range weapons is that they are more vulnerable against multiple enemies. That usually requires taking even more damage in order to keep up, which can leave you more vulnerable against the bigger enemies. Otherwise, adding explosive weapons or extra pierce is another way to compensate for it. Also, specifically on the Abyss, the new map, fully offensive builds are weaker since it's easier to get punished by a random charger or projectile. Offense is still a priority, but you want to build more defenses in comparison to the old map. SMG is one of the best weapons in the entire game. It has high single target damage, scales very well with range damage, and it's very strong even on lower tiers. It's extremely fast, and it's also one of the best weapons at utilizing lifesteal. SMG main disadvantage is that it can struggle against too many enemies, especially without pierce or when behind with offense. Range damage is the main priority, while attack speed is only useful at certain breakpoints, 1%, 34%, 51%, and 201%, but that's usually very unnecessary. Otherwise, you get no value from the stat. SMG is also very good with shredders in case of horde waves. Usually a 4 SMG to shredder split is the ideal. In a way, Revolver is fairly similar to SMG, but it requires more attack speed to mitigate the long reload. The main downsides of Revolver is that it's quite expensive and it can be weak early on due to the long reload. Like SMG, it can struggle against many enemies, and usually it requires more stats to outshine their damage. Similarly to SMG, it's very good to mix revolvers with shredders in case of horde waves. Shotgun has good single target and decent clear thanks to the extra projectiles and pierce. It also scales very well with upgrades, especially on tier 4 since it gains even more projectiles. The downside of Shotgun are that it can be fairly weak early on. This is mostly a combination of low damage, a slow attack, and a lower accuracy that can lead to wasting shots unless very close to your enemies. Also, Sharp Bullet is very bad for shotgun since it reduces its overall damage, but you often want that item for guns like SMG and Revolver. In general, avoid Sharp Bullet if you're building mostly shotguns. Pumpkins are also great, and shotguns are very good with SMG since they will scale primarily with range damage. Shredder is good clear, especially considering that's one of the main downsides of many ranged weapons. Shredder downside is its low single target damage, and the fact that the explosion chance is fairly low on lower tiers. Shredders are still a very good addition to almost any ranged weapons that struggles against multiple enemies, especially when facing horde waves. Slingshot has good damage and decent clear once upgraded, since it gains extra bounces. One of the main downsides is its primitive tag. The extra health from primitive is quite nice, especially early on, but it doesn't share a tag with other ranged damage weapons. Instead, it shares the tag with many melee weapons that you don't want, which can make slingshots a bit more inconsistent to build in comparison to guns. Also, lower tier slingshots can be quite weak since they struggle against many enemies. Mixing them with other weapons can compensate for some of their issues, allowing you to combine them earlier and avoid staying for too long with lower tier ones. Rocket Launcher is mostly a better shredder. It doesn't have pierce, but it has a guaranteed explosion at any rank that deals a lot more damage. Also, it gets a lot stronger with upgrades. Grenade Launcher causes a small explosion, and it needs to reload after a few shots. However, it has amazing scaling from stats and upgrades, to the point that it becomes one of the strongest weapons in the game. Because of the multiple scaling from crit and bounces, Grenade Launcher is also amazing when cursed. Nuclear Launcher is easily one of the best weapons in the game. It's quite slow, but it has very high damage and a large explosion. Minigun is mostly a stronger SMG, which is enough to make it a good weapon. It's not particularly amazing on tier 3, but it becomes a lot stronger at tier 4. Sniper gun is a very situational weapon. It rarely wants to be mixed with other guns since it scales primarily with range and wants high crit, but it can be a very strong addition to builds that are pushing the stats like crossbow. Also, it's not great at tier 3, but it becomes very strong at tier 4. Obliterator is mostly a stronger laser gun. It's very weak against multiple enemies and amazing a single target. Because of this, it should be avoided if already struggling against multiple enemies, otherwise it's great for elite and bosses. In this case, I'm considering elemental builds anything that utilizes elemental weapons and scales with elemental damage. Therefore, elemental builds can play like a melee or a range build depending on the weapon, sharing many of their advantages and disadvantages. Generally, elemental builds can mix weapons very effectively, especially to compensate for potential weaknesses. Elemental weapons tend to scale very well with upgrades since they often have extra effects like burn or more projectiles, and it's also a lot easier to scale elemental damage due to the quality of its items. However, elemental builds are often weaker in the early game. This is mostly because many starting elemental weapons are quite weak, especially when on lower tiers, so it may take a while to get those upgrades or transition into stronger weapons. Another downside is that burn is the primary source of damage for many elemental weapons, but since the burn damage doesn't stack, it becomes very inefficient to play them together. You normally want to avoid multiple weapons with burn, but sometimes you might have to play them anyway, especially when waiting for them to be combined. Lightning Shiv is one of the best weapons in the game. Especially when upgraded, it has amazing clear due to the amount of projectiles that it can generate, and that makes it a very good weapon for lifesteal. Most of Lightning Shiv damage comes from the elemental projectiles, but its direct hit scales with melee damage. This means that the elemental damage is the main priority, but you normally want to invest in a little bit of melee damage so that you can kill smaller enemies with a direct hit. Considering the Shiv is a melee weapon with low direct hit damage, getting some range for extra safety is usually very good. 50 to 100 is usually a good spot, but more is always better as long as you can afford it. Icicle has high single target damage, high range and good crit scaling. It's one of the best elemental weapons, especially early on, but similarly to other ranged weapons, it can struggle against many enemies. Flamethrower is easily one of the best weapons in the game for a multitude of reasons. It has very high damage from burn, and considering that it's very fast, you can get amazing value from lifesteal and knockback, making it a great weapon both offensively and defensively. The only major downside is that you rarely want more than one since the burn doesn't stack. For elemental builds, Thunder Sword is quite similar to a Lightning Shiv. It has stronger direct damage, but the projectiles need more elemental damage to scale. Also, like most tier 3 weapons, it gets a lot stronger at tier 4. As said before, Nuclear Launcher is one of the best weapons in the game, and it's even easier to scale its damage in an elemental build. Engineering builds are mostly just screwdrivers or wrench builds, since these are the only early options for engineering. A big advantage of engineering builds is that they don't need offensive stats outside of some engineering, which means that you can prioritize defenses instead. Overall, the damage of engineering builds is usually lower than other builds, and since they're fairly different, you rarely want to mix wrenches with screwdrivers. Usually, some characters tend to favor one or the other, but at least it's fairly easy to transition between them since they are the only weapons that share the tool tag in the early game. Wrenches are usually stronger than screwdrivers since the turrets tend to be more effective, especially with upgrades. With many turrets, especially if they spawn close together, it becomes a lot easier to focus down enemies, creating safer areas around them. Also, tier 4 turrets are very strong, and you often want to combine ranges in order to rush tier 4s as soon as possible, instead of spreading out upgrades like you do with most weapons. However, wrenches have a few downsides over screwdrivers. First of all, there is no engineering scaling in the wrench direct hit, and that can be quite bad against smaller enemies, especially later in the run. Wrenches are also a lot more expensive, and that can cause a significant delay on getting the tier 4 turrets. Then, the burn from the tier 2 turrets doesn't stack, so it's important to avoid having too many of them. Lastly, since structures spawn randomly in the map, some waves can be significantly harder just because your turrets are too far away from one another, making it a lot harder to focus down bigger enemies. Sometimes, adding some screwdrivers to your build can be useful to rush a tier 4 turret as soon as possible. This is especially helpful in case of horde waves, also because the screwdriver itself can help more against smaller enemies. As I mentioned before, screwdrivers are one of the cheapest weapons, so they're easier to upgrade and you'll have more money that can be used for other stats. Its direct hit scales partially with engineering, and the mines themselves get extra scaling from explosive damage, which can be particularly useful on some characters. Overall, since the mine damage is more spread out, it's harder to kill bigger enemies, and that means that you have to move around a lot more, trying to lure enemies on top of your mines. Because of this playstyle, movement speed becomes even more valuable. Chainsaw can be a nice addition to some engineering builds, since its direct hit scales with engineering. However, it's not always worth it, especially since you often avoid building damage with engineering builds. That shall be it for build archetypes and their best starting weapons. As usual, it's very likely that I forgot something, but hopefully nothing too important. If you have questions, feel free to ask in the comments, or you can find me live on Twitch almost every day. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on my next video.